After decades of fighting a bureaucratic battle, 80-year-old veteran Harold Monroe finally received his life-changing $76,400 retroactive disability check from the VA. This U.S. Treasury document wasn't just money, it was validation, a ticket to mend his trailer and finally meet his grandson. Yet, upon attempting a simple deposit at his lifelong bank, a young teller named Emma shockingly deemed the check irregular and, disregarding his veteran's ID, shredded it right before his eyes, turning his long-awaited justice into mere strips of paper. Humiliated but undeterred, Harold didn't rage. Instead, he made one fateful call. Little did Emma know, this quiet veteran had powerful connections, and the consequences of her actions were about to shake the very foundations of the bank. If Harold's story resonated with you, imagine the countless untold veteran stories. Join our community dedicated to honoring these voices. Like, share, and subscribe to my channel to ensure stories like Harold's are not just heard, but uplifted. Your support helps us amplify their legacy and fight for everyday respect. Sir, this paper feels wrong. The numbers aren't adding up. I'm going to have to destroy this. The young teller's voice was flat, almost rehearsed, as she eyed the check with suspicion. Across the counter, Harold Monroe didn't move at first. Then slowly, purposefully, he placed both hands down on the cool surface of the counter, fingers splayed wide as if bracing for impact. "That's a United States Treasury check, young lady," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's real, it's earned, and I've waited half my life for it." She didn't blink, not once. With a cold snap and the dull whir of a shredder coming to life, the check disappeared between steel teeth. Just like that. In seconds, everything Harold had waited for, fought for, was reduced to strips of curling paper, his future torn apart before his eyes. She didn't know who he was. Not yet. 5 minutes later, two sleek black sedans screeched to a halt outside the bank. Suits emerged, federal agents from the Treasury Department's Internal Audit Division, storming through the glass doors without so much as a warning. They weren't here for a robbery. They were here because someone had just shredded the lifeline of a soldier. And when the man behind that piece of paper calls the Treasury directly, someone always answers. Harold Monroe wasn't the kind of man who stood out in a crowd. He liked it that way. At 80, he moved a little slower, his back slightly bent from a lifetime of honest labor. His hands were toughened from decades of turning wrenches and lifting crates, the skin weathered like sun-dried leather. And his eyes, though heavy with age, still held the quiet alertness of someone who once read enemy terrain under moonlight and falling mortars. That part of him had never dulled. He had served in silence. No medals pinned to his chest in parade ceremonies. No welcome home banners when he returned. 2 grueling tours near the Korean demilitarized zone in the 1960s. Then years later, a return during Desert Storm, not in combat, but in logistics. He wasn't the man firing the rifle. He was the one who made sure the guy holding it had bullets, clean water, fuel, and gear that worked. And anyone who's ever served knows those jobs can save more lives than a rifle ever could. Now, in his twilight years, Harold lived alone in a faded aluminum trailer on the outer edge of Bakersfield, California. A forgotten corner of a city where mailboxes leaned like crooked teeth and dogs barked at the wind just for something to do. His neighbors barely noticed him, and he never asked for more than the basics. The disability checks from the VA were modest, but they arrived until they didn't. For more than 2 decades, Harold had been locked in a different kind of fight. A battle against silence. A war with red tape. After Desert Storm, his health had begun to unravel. First came the violent coughing fits, then the strange skin lesions, then the shooting nerve pain that would drop him to his knees without warning. The doctors could only speculate. Harold had his own theory, Agent Orange, a chemical ghost from Vietnam that had long outlived the war, creeping into lungs and skin, destroying from within. Like so many others, Harold filed a claim with the VA, and like so many others, he waited and waited. Letters arrived, then nothing. Then new letters, asking for paperwork he had already sent twice. Reviews, delays, then silence again. It went on for years, but in 2023, with the VA under mounting public pressure and more than 200,000 unresolved cases piled high in the system, something shifted. The department began reopening old files. Somewhere in that mountain of neglected folders, they found Harold's. And there it was, clear evidence that his exposure during a forgotten supply drop near the Kuwaiti border qualified under the revised guidelines. After all those years, they approved his claim. Not just approved, it was retroactive, a compensation of over $76,000 in back pay, money Harold had given up hoping for. But more than that, it was recognition. A whisper from the very institution that had forgotten him, finally saying, "You matter. We remember." To Harold, it was more than a sum on paper. It was dignity. It was the chance to patch the sagging roof on his trailer that leaked every winter, to pay off medical bills he had been ignoring for too long, to maybe, just maybe, buy a bus ticket to Oregon and meet Caleb, his 10-year-old grandson, for the very first time. He'd only seen the boy's face in photographs, but he'd memorized every detail. So that morning, Harold did what he always did when something important needed doing. He rose early. He shaved carefully and pressed the one shirt he still considered good. He slipped the check into an envelope alongside his VA and driver's license. And then he walked, slow but steady, to the Consolidated Trust Bank, the same one he'd trusted for more than 40 years. He expected a quiet transaction. No applause, no one to take a picture or shake his hand, just a signature and a nod. That was all. But the world had other plans. Inside that envelope was more than just money. It was proof, weighty, embossed, unmistakable. The top left corner carried the stamp he had once stopped believing would ever appear again. U.S. Department of the Treasury. $76,400. And before he even opened it, Harold Monroe already knew. It wasn't just a check, it was an answer. He didn't say a word when he saw the number, just sank into the creaky kitchen chair beside the old table in his trailer, the one with the chipped formica corner and a sun-bleached placemat that hadn't been changed in years. He let out a long, tired breath. The letter trembled slightly in his hands as he read it again. Then again. Its tone was clinical, detached, full of formal phrases that had long since lost meaning. Retroactive compensation, determined eligible, approved under expanded Agent Orange exposure guidelines. But the message beneath the coldness of the language was finally clear. After years of waiting, years of unanswered letters, appeals that vanished into bureaucratic limbo, endless phone calls that circled through departments incapable of helping, Harold Monroe had finally been heard. He had learned to stop expecting answers, learned to stop getting angry. He had become used to enduring in silence, the same way so many other veterans had. But now he held proof in his hand, a check, real, solid, and impossible to ignore. And suddenly there were choices again. He pulled a yellow legal pad from the drawer beside the sink and began writing. First, fix the leaking roof. Bakersfield winters weren't forgiving, and another storm could make the damage worse. Second, clear the old medical bills piling up on the counter, the ones he'd stopped opening months ago. Third, replace the broken water heater that had forced him into too many cold showers. And lastly, underlined with slow, deliberate strokes, visit Maggie and Caleb. His daughter Maggie had left for Eugene, Oregon, over 10 years ago. Life had a way of splintering people apart. There had been misunderstandings, quiet disappointments, miles that turned into years, and then, more than anything, a silence that grew heavy with time. She had a son now. Caleb, 10 years old. Harold had only ever seen him in fading photographs and through glitchy video calls that cut in and out. But now he could go, buy a ticket, bring a gift, knock on the door like he still mattered, show up with dignity. He didn't rush. The next morning before the sun was fully up, he ironed his one good shirt, the blue one with the stiff collar, and carefully tucked the check into a manila envelope along with his VA ID and driver's license. He checked the Greyhound schedule for buses headed north, though he didn't book anything just yet. First things first, deposit the check. He took the bus downtown to the same bank he'd used since 1983, Consolidated Trust. They'd changed locations once, updated their logo twice, and gone through more tellers than he could remember. But Harold had never felt the need to bank anywhere else. He believed in loyalty. Habit, too. He pushed through the glass doors and gave a polite nod to the security guard. The lobby was quiet, just a light flow of midday customers. A faint scent of printer ink mixed with the weak aroma of burnt coffee, while the HVAC system rumbled softly overhead. The walls were a dull beige, designed more for functionality than charm. He joined the short line, standing with his hands clasped over the envelope. From behind, he looked like any old man, worn jacket, silver hair, steady posture. But he stood straighter than most, with a quiet pride that hadn't been dulled by time. Around him, others went about their business. A mother bouncing a baby in a stroller, a young man tapping away at his phone, a couple of retirees catching up in murmured tones. No one looked at him twice. When it was his turn, the teller who waved him forward looked young enough to be his granddaughter. Her name tag said Emma, and her smile was bright but mechanical, friendly in a way that came from training, not from warmth. "Good morning, ma'am," Harold said, nodding politely. "I'd like to deposit this check, please." He slid the envelope across the counter. She opened it with quick, practiced fingers. The moment her eyes landed on the document inside, on the government seal, on the number written in bold black ink, her expression changed, her smile flickered. "This is quite a large amount." "Yes, ma'am, it's retroactive disability pay from the VA." She raised the check to the light, inspecting it like it might be counterfeit. Then she ran it beneath a small ultraviolet scanner, frowning ever so slightly. The scanner beeped. She turned back to her screen and began typing, the clack of keys steady and fast. The check was real. But from that moment on, everything else stopped going as expected. The check was gone. "I'm sorry, sir, but this check is highly irregular," the young woman said, her voice slipping from polite concern into the mechanical cadence of corporate policy. "The paper doesn't feel standard. The routing numbers aren't in the usual format. And this signature," she tapped the corner with a manicured nail, "it doesn't match the standard VA disbursement styles we're familiar with." Harold Monroe arched an eyebrow. "Ma'am, that check was issued by the Department of Veterans Affairs. That's a U.S. Treasury document. You're welcome to verify it." "I don't need to," she responded curtly. "We have procedures for handling potentially fraudulent instruments, and this one," she punctuated with another tap on the check, "raises too many red flags." Without breaking eye contact, Harold reached into the inner pocket of his worn coat and pulled out 2 cards. He laid them on the counter, his veteran's identification and his driver's license. "My name is printed right there. These match the one on the check. I've been banking at this branch longer than you've been alive." She barely looked down. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, voice now chilled and unwavering, "but I'm going to have to destroy this." Harold stared at her, trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. "I beg your pardon?" "It's policy," she replied with a practiced calm. "When a check is flagged as suspicious, it must be voided and removed from circulation. That includes physical destruction. We can't take the risk of it being presented somewhere else." Before Harold could utter another word, she turned briskly to the shredder beside her desk. The machine was industrial grade, clearly meant for thick internal memos or outdated ledgers, not symbols of a government promise. With one swift, confident movement, she fed the check into the blades. The sound it made was surprisingly soft, a mechanical click, followed by a low, whirring hum. White fragments of the check, the proof of his service, his due, a quiet acknowledgement of sacrifices made long ago, floated down into the bin beneath. Harold said nothing. The line behind him fell into silence. A woman gasped softly. Someone murmured something that sounded like Jesus. Even the security guard near the front door shifted on his feet, uncomfortable. But Emma, the teller, remained composed. "If it was legitimate," she said with a shrug, "you can always request a replacement, but we won't be able to process it today." Slowly, Harold picked up his ID cards. His fingers trembled, not from age, but from something deeper, something colder. A hurt that had calcified over decades, now cracked wide open again. He looked at her, but not with rage. Instead, with the stunned disbelief of a man who had survived more than most, only to be met with quiet dismissal. He turned, straightened his back, and walked out of the bank. Not a word spoken. Outside, the sunlight felt harsher than before. Or maybe it was just the sting. Knowing that no matter the years given, the scars carried, the silence endured, there were still places he didn't matter. But Harold Monroe was not finished. He made his way to a metal bench just outside the building, one of those bolted down ones facing the sun-washed parking lot, the asphalt shimmering in the California heat. Slowly, he lowered himself onto the seat, his hands resting on his knees, still shaking slightly. For a long time, he just breathed. He wasn't angry in the way people usually meant, not the kind of anger that shouted or stormed. This was something older, colder, a stillness that came only when a sacred line had been crossed, one drawn not in ink or policy, but in sacrifice, in blood, in silence. With a long breath, Harold reached into his jacket once more and pulled out an old flip phone, its surface worn smooth by years of use and memory. He opened it. Not many numbers were saved in it anymore, but one was still pinned to the top, untouched for years. He pressed the call button and one ring, then another, a click, then a voice, calm, steady, unmistakable despite the passage of time. "Easton here." Harold's own voice was quiet but steady. "It's Harold Monroe." There was a pause, then the tone shifted. "Harold." A beat, then sharper. "What's going on?" Harold explained. Slowly, clearly, no dramatics, just the facts. The check, the bank teller, the shredder, the humiliation. Raymond Easton didn't interrupt, but Harold could hear it, the way his friend's breathing changed, a low, tight silence full of pressure, a kind of fury that didn't need volume to be felt. "You at the bank now?" Raymond asked. "Outside, sitting on a bench." "Don't move," Easton said, his voice crisp and commanding. "I mean it. Stay right where you are." For a brief moment, Harold was no longer in the sun of a California sidewalk. He was somewhere else, long ago, another desert, another war. Gulf War, 1991. Easton had been a young colonel then, commanding a convoy of munitions snaking its way through a sandstorm in southern Iraq. A wrong turn, confusion, panic, then mortar fire, the kind that didn't give you time to think. Men froze, but Harold, a senior logistics sergeant back then, calm under fire, compass in hand, grit in his gut, and a torn map wedged between his fingers, rerouted the entire convoy out of danger. He hadn't raised his voice then either. He hadn't needed to. He sat alone on the bench, hands folded, the weight of the past pressing down on him like a silent companion. That map, once marked in grease pencil, had told the story of 47 men who had lived because of one man's steady hands and sharper mind. That day had long passed, but Easton had never let it slip from memory. Neither had Harold Monroe. Now, years later, the same sergeant, once calm under fire, sat still, his pride wounded, his faith in the system torn apart like the check Emma Caldwell had so casually destroyed. Harold's voice, quieter now but harder, carried steel beneath its surface. "You gave me your word back then. I owe you mine now, and I still carry a bit more weight than I did in 91. Give me 10 minutes. He ended the call without waiting for a reply and set his phone down beside him. He didn't check the time, didn't glance around, didn't even shift his posture. He waited, not with impatience, but with certainty. He didn't know what Easton would do, but he knew who Easton was, and that was all he needed to know. 8 minutes passed, maybe 10. Harold hadn't moved from the bench, hadn't made another call. His phone remained silent, and still he sat, calm, composed, watching. Then they came. 2 sedans, sleek, black, and unmarked, pulled into the bank's parking lot. Their approach was smooth, unhurried. No screeching tires, no sirens, no fanfare. Just a tight turn and quick, exact stops. Not a show, not intimidation, just precision. 4 people stepped out in unison. 2 men, 2 women, each wore a tailored dark suit, sunglasses, earpieces. They walked with purpose, not as visitors, but like people accustomed to being the final word in any room they entered. One of the women carried a slim black briefcase. One of the men wore a gold lapel pin shaped like an eagle mid-flight. Harold didn't smile, didn't nod, just reached up and adjusted the brim of his cap. Inside, the shift in atmosphere was instant. The low hum of conversation died out. Fingers froze above keyboards. Emma looked up from behind the teller glass, her brow furrowing as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The group didn't raise their voices, just moved forward with silent authority. Badges appeared, flashed with crisp, practiced efficiency. Treasury Department, Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, Internal Audit Division. The voice was that of the lead woman, sharply spoken but without hostility. Only purpose. Manager on site? Carl Devlin, the branch manager, lifted his head at the exact wrong moment. Two agents were already at his office door, stepping in without knocking. The remaining two approached Emma. "Miss Emma Caldwell?" the man asked evenly. She nodded once, blinking. "You'll come with us, please." Her voice cracked. "Is this about the check?" The female agent, voice flat and without room for doubt, added, "Yes." They led her to a small side room. As the door closed, the audit team got to work at the manager's terminal. Screens came alive, logs scrolled fast, commands typed with quiet precision. One agent pulled up surveillance from Emma's station. The video was high definition, no ambiguity, no distortions. It showed Harold Monroe standing calmly at the counter, holding the check. His voice measured, his documentation placed neatly before him. Then, without escalation, without pause, without consulting anyone, Emma took the check and fed it straight into the shredder. Inside the side room, Emma sat, hands starting to tremble. I thought it was fake," she stammered. "Based on what?" Agent Malik asked, seated across from her. His tone wasn't cruel, but it was firm, measured. The paper felt off, and the amount, it was a lot. We don't usually see Treasury checks that big. "Did you scan the routing number?" "Yes, but it didn't match what I'm used to." "Did you call your manager?" "No, I didn't want it to be cashed if it was fraudulent." "So you destroyed a federal financial instrument," Malik said, his voice flat now. "Based on a feeling?" Emma looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "I thought I was following policy." "You were not," Malik said sharply, flipping open a binder and pointing to a highlighted section. "Page 17, paragraph 3 of your bank's protocol regarding questionable financial instruments. In all cases involving suspected federal documents, escalation is mandatory to a floor supervisor or through the designated Treasury verification hotline. Destruction is explicitly prohibited unless verified by management or flagged as confirmed Treasury fraud." Emma's eyes widened as they scanned the words she had never fully read during training. Her mouth fell open slightly. The blood drained from her cheeks. Back in the main lobby, Carl Devlin was sweating. The pressure from the agents was suffocating. His every motion seemed scrutinized. One team was already printing copies of every check processed at Emma's terminal over the past 72 hours. Surveillance footage was being downloaded to an encrypted drive. A call had already gone out, directly to the Consolidated Trust Regional Headquarters. And that was only the beginning. The final blow landed without fanfare. One of the agents announced clear and cold, "Miss Caldwell is suspended effective immediately." Another added, "The Treasury Secretary has personally requested a preliminary report by end of business today." The words weren't shouted, just spoken like commands that had already been executed. From the bench outside the bank, Harold Monroe sat still, watching the agents walk back to their black sedans without so much as a glance around. No flashing lights, no handcuffs, no shouting. Just quiet, decisive authority. The very system that had humiliated him barely an hour earlier had now turned on itself, with swiftness, with force, and with a sense of purpose that no one inside that branch had anticipated. Harold didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence was rooted, solid, a sentinel of stone watching justice unfold in real time. The black vehicle still loomed outside, and through the bank's wide windows, Harold could see motion, heads turning, staff whispering. At the front desk, the agents had taken control with a calm efficiency, like it had all been rehearsed 100 times before. But Harold didn't need the visuals. He could feel the change in the air. The pressure inside that building had shifted. The energy had curdled into fear, realization, regret, The quiet tension of people recognizing too late that they had made a very serious mistake. Then the glass doors opened. Emma Caldwell emerged first. She wasn't being dragged, but she wasn't walking freely either. Her steps were stiff, mechanical, like her limbs no longer remembered confidence. One agent flanked her side, the other walked just behind. Her shoulders were no longer squared. Her gaze never lifted. She didn't need to look at Harold to know he was still there. He hadn't moved. She felt him. Silent, immovable, watching. Behind her, Carl Devlin stood just inside the lobby, a sheet of paper trembling in his hand. A regional executive leaned in close, whispering with sharp urgency. Devlin looked lost, like a man who had stepped into a gunfight with nothing but a clipboard. He wouldn't be fired, not today, but the damage was done. He'd been deemed unreliable. The agents had issued a recommendation, immediate probation, along with mandatory federal compliance retraining. A corporate euphemism, really. What they meant was, you'll keep your gate, but no one will ever fully trust you again. The glass doors shut gently behind the last agent. Outside, one of them gave Harold a brief, wordless nod. It wasn't a salute, but it was close. It was the kind of nod exchanged between people who had both served and understood things too deep for words. It was respect, earned. Then Harold's phone buzzed in the pocket of his worn jacket. He drew it out slowly. The screen read, U.S. Treasury private line. He answered, voice steady. Monroe. Harold, said a voice, warm and commanding. This is Secretary Daniels. Harold straightened instinctively. Even after all these years, that tone, disciplined, resolute, still struck a chord that had been forged in uniform. Sir, he replied. I've just finished reading the preliminary report from our field agents, Daniel said. Let me be clear, this isn't about a check. This is about something much bigger. It's about respect, about how our institutions treat the people who've carried this country through its hardest hours. And I want to say personally, I'm deeply sorry for what you experienced today. Harold said nothing, not because he was angry, but because there was nothing more powerful than silence when the truth had been acknowledged. We've already processed a full replacement payment, Daniels continued. It's being deposited into your account electronically. You'll see it by end of day. 7/400, no delays, no further steps required. Harold exhaled slowly. Thank you, sir. But the secretary wasn't finished. No, he said firmly. Thank you, Staff Sergeant, for your patience, your service, and for reminding us what can happen when people forget who they're serving. The call ended cleanly, no flourish. Harold looked up. The sky had cleared. The breeze felt softer now, warmer, lighter. That same check, treated like a burden just hours ago, had been restored. But more than money had been returned. Meaning had been returned. Dignity had been returned. For the first time in a very long while, Harold Monroe didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel like some forgotten soldier tucked into the footnotes of history. He felt seen, a man, not a number, a veteran, not a nuisance. The story of Harold Monroe didn't ripple across the country because of the dollar amount on a government-issued check. No, it resonated because it revealed a deeper truth, a festering truth, one that had been ignored for decades, hidden in the margins of America's conscience. The quiet neglect, the casual disrespect of the very people who had worn the uniform in silence and service. From the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of Iraq, or from the oil fires of Kuwait to the rugged peaks of Afghanistan, American veterans had returned home not to banners or fanfare, but to silence, sometimes even suspicion. Ask any Vietnam veteran what it felt like to step off the plane in 1972. Most won't talk about pride. They'll talk about shame. Not their own, but the country's. They'll remember the jeers, the protesters, the bitter welcome for those who had only ever done what was asked of them. Society never really figured out how to separate the war from the people who fought in it. So veterans like Harold did what they had to do. They buried it, buried the pain, the frustration, the disappointments. They came home, kept their heads down, and moved on, carrying their scars in silence. Then came the Gulf War. Fast, televised, neatly packaged for public consumption. America clapped politely, waved flags at parades, and then forgot. Veterans returned to a country that said thank you, but didn't bother to follow through. No one checked in when the headaches didn't stop. No one followed up on the strange skin rashes, the endless coughing, the memory lapses and tremors. Thousands of former service members reported these symptoms: mysterious illnesses, undiagnosed conditions, damaged lungs, confused nervous systems. But for over a decade, the government insisted there was nothing wrong. It wasn't until much later that anyone in charge admitted Gulf War syndrome was real. And the ones who came home from Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom, they walked straight into a new kind of war. Burn pits fouled their lungs. Blasts scrambled their brains. PTSD sank its teeth into their minds. Their paperwork got lost. Claims were delayed for years. Suicide hotlines rang off the hook, but no one picked up. Clinics were too full, too slow, too underfunded, and all the while they waited. So when Harold Monroe stepped into that bank, check in hand, he wasn't just one veteran with one piece of paper. He carried every injury ignored, every benefit delayed, every unanswered phone call. That check wasn't just compensation. It was proof that someone somewhere had finally acknowledged his service. And when the teller ran it through the shredder like trash, she wasn't just destroying paper. She was tearing open a wound that had never fully healed. What struck people the most about Harold's story wasn't the sudden corrupt government response or the black cars outside the bank. It was the quiet strength of a man who never asked for more than what he'd earned. A man who waited patiently, politely, through years of silence. A man who didn't yell, didn't demand, who simply made a phone call after every other door had closed. That kind of grace, that kind of steadiness resonated. Because there are so many Harold Monroes in this country, and most of them never make headlines. Like the veteran in Missouri who died in the waiting room of a private hospital because the staff didn't understand how VA billing worked. Or the Marine in Pennsylvania who spiraled when his PTSD medication ran out. His paperwork misplaced somewhere in a government system too bloated to care. Or the World War II nurse in Oregon who was told her old VA ID didn't count anymore and watched a lifetime of service get questioned at the pharmacy counter. These aren't just personal tragedies. They're warnings. They speak to something deeper. The sense that many older Americans, especially those who wore the uniform, feel left behind. They answered the call when the nation needed them. Now they wait in line again, for care, for recognition, sometimes just to be heard. And too often the systems built to support them treat them not as honored veterans, but as inconveniences. Forgotten relics of a time no one wants to think about anymore. Harold's story hit a nerve because it pulled back the curtain on what service looks like when the uniform is off. It isn't loud. It doesn't push its way forward. It waits, often far too long, until someone crosses a line. And then it doesn't explode. It simply refuses to be ignored any longer. We have to do better, not just with policies and benefits, but with everyday dignity. Not through grand gestures, but through the simple, human acts of decency every veteran has earned. The true tragedy of what happened at that bank wasn't the shredded check. It was that Harold Monroe didn't expect better, that he didn't think anyone would care. And that's what needs to change. There's a line between policy and principle, between doing what the rule book says and doing what's right. And somewhere along the way, too many people have forgotten that difference. Emma Caldwell claims she followed protocol. But in truth, what she followed was fear. She saw something unfamiliar, something she didn't take the time to understand. And instead of asking questions, she acted quickly, blindly, without context or care. Her decision to destroy a U.S. Treasury check wasn't grounded in proper training. It came from assumption. Policy is meant to protect systems. Principle is meant to protect people. Emma respected neither. She skipped every escalation step, ignored the ID card Harold had handed her. She shredded a check she didn't recognize, not because she was malicious, but because she was unprepared. She confused authority with comprehension. Her instincts weren't built on wisdom. They were shaped by hesitation and uncertainty, and that's the silent crisis eating away at many of today's institutions. The disappearance of generational wisdom. There was a time when younger employees learned by watching, when respect for experience wasn't optional, it was expected. A time when mentorship taught patience and perspective. But that era is fading. In its place, we've inserted rigid processes and snap decisions. The human lessons, the empathy, the listening, the recognition, have been lost in the shuffle. And now, in their absence, we're left with scenes like the one Harold endured, a moment that could have been handled with humility, instead defined by haste. And this is only the beginning. Decisions rooted in the fear of being wrong can shape entire systems, and too often they do. But Harold Monroe was different. He didn't shout. He didn't demand to be noticed. He stood still, calm, composed, and anchored in something far deeper than pride or frustration. He understood exactly what that check meant, what it represented. Not just money, but recognition, a promise kept, a thread connecting his service to the life he was trying to hold together. He knew who he was, and above all, he knew that panic never brings justice closer. When Emma Caldwell, the young bank teller, responded to his presence with suspicion, Harold met her with silence. Where she acted in haste, he moved with deliberate grace. Her instincts were shaped by fear, fear of making a mistake, fear of breaking protocol. His were molded by experience, by endurance, by the quiet strength it takes to stay standing when the world tries to dismiss you. In that single moment in the bank, what was torn wasn't just a piece of paper. It was trust, dignity, and a man's right to be heard. That encounter became something far greater than a dispute over a check. It exposed the fracture in a system that too often forgets the very people it's supposed to serve. And Harold, in his stillness, became the mirror that forced it to look back on itself. He didn't give speeches. He didn't ask for anyone's sympathy. He didn't even raise an eyebrow. He simply stayed still, anchored like an old oak weathered by storms. And in that stillness, a message was sent that needed no words. Within 72 hours, not tucked away in legal jargon, not whispered behind closed doors. It was printed in the local newspaper, taped to the branch doors, and circulated widely across social media. The bank didn't just admit a procedural error, they named it for what it was, a personal failure. They didn't just apologize to a customer, they apologized to Harold Monroe by name. They called him a veteran. They called what had happened a grave misjudgment, no sugarcoating, no deflection. Emma Caldwell was quietly removed from her position. The regional manager who had initially defended her actions was reassigned. The branch itself went through immediate retraining, not just on Treasury policy, but on how to speak to human beings with respect, particularly those who had worn a uniform or now walked a little slower with age. And the impact didn't stop there. From Washington, real systemic change rippled outward. The Treasury Department launched a new mandatory training module across all federally insured financial institutions. Its title, Veterans Are Not Variables. It centered the human stories behind the paperwork, the earned dignity carried in every VA-issued document, and the long, often exhausting path veterans must walk just to claim what they were promised. It was, at long last, a recognition that systems should serve the people, not the other way around. But Harold Monroe? He didn't care for headlines. He didn't linger for applause. The following Friday, he packed a simple duffel bag. Inside, he carefully folded his military jacket, creased sharp as memory, and headed for the Greyhound station. His reissued check had cleared. The roof repairs were scheduled. The bills were handled, but Harold had somewhere more important to be. As the bus pulled out of Bakersfield, heading north through the dry California light, Harold settled into a window seat. Chin resting in one hand, he gazed out at the open road, the land stretching wide and silent before him. In Eugene, Oregon, a 10-year-old boy named Caleb was waiting. For the first time, Harold would meet his grandson, and for once in a long, long time, his journey didn't require paperwork or battle plans or grit, just presence, just being there. In the end, this wasn't a story about a bank error. It wasn't even just about a man and a check. It was about what it means to be seen, to be truly seen. It was about dignity, earned through years of sacrifice, and what happens when that dignity is overlooked until it stands quietly in the room and demands to be noticed without ever speaking a word. Harold Monroe didn't storm through the doors or raise his fist. He didn't shout. He stood still. And that stillness echoed louder than any outrage ever could. In a world spinning faster by the day, where speed is mistaken for strength and noise for importance, it's easy to overlook someone who moves slow, speaks soft, or holds themselves with the quiet confidence of another time. But maybe that's where we've lost our way. Maybe what we need are more people like Harold, people who remind us that principles should never be sacrificed for policy, that respect shouldn't hinge on appearance, attire, or the year stamped on an ID card. So think back. Have you ever seen someone do the right thing quietly, without fanfare, and be ignored for it or rewarded? Is it that young people today have lost that sense of reverence? Or is it that no one took the time to show them what it looks like? Share your story if you have one, because someone out there might need to hear it. And as for Harold, his silence wasn't weakness. It was memory. It was legacy. And it was everything this world still needs to learn how to listen to.